I just wanted to welcome you to our first Books in Print of the year. Today we're going to hear Joyce Suechun Cheng and Edgar Garcia, welcome,
Thanks.
Who will be discussing Professor Cheng's new book, The Persistence of Masks, Surrealism and the Ethnography of the Subject, published by the University of Minnesota Press in October of 2025. Joyce Suechun Cheng is an associate professor in the history of art and architecture in the College of Design at the University of Oregon. She conducts research and teaches in the visual arts, poetics, and aesthetic theories of international modernisms and avant-gardes. Her essays and articles on data, surrealism, and primitivism have appeared in journals such as Modernism, Modernity, Race, Anthropology and Aesthetics, and Gradiva. She has contributed to edited anthologies such as the Cambridge Critical Concepts, Surrealism, the International Encyclopedia of Surrealism, Surrealism, Key Concepts, Neolithic Childhood, Art in a False Presence, circa 1930, and Virgin Microbe, New Data Studies. Edgar Garcia is an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago. He is a poet and a scholar of the hemispheric cultures of the Americas. His scholarship and creative practices are concerned with the world-bearing qualities of literary works, especially poetics, taking place at the intersection of anthropology and literary studies. He's the author of Emergency, Reading the Popol Vuh in a Time of Crisis, which came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2022, a collection of 9 essays that show what this foundational creation story of the indigenous Americas, the Popol Vuh, has to teach people about the relation between emergency and emergence. Professor Garcia will also give a public lecture titled Migrant Glyphs this evening at 5:30 p.m. in 110 Willamette Hall. He will explore some of the geoglyphs in the Sonoran Desert and their life at the intersection of indigeneity and migration in the Americas. So don't miss that this evening. Today, Professors Garcia and Cheng will engage in a discussion of Professor Cheng's book, informed by their shared approaches to poetics and aesthetics through the lens of anthropology. And I gather that the plan is that you will have a conversation, the two of you, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A after that, a discussion with the audience after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and preceded by a very short presentation.
Preceded by a very short presentation. So, without further ado, welcome.
So thank you for taking 1 hour of your busy schedule to be here to listen to this presentation of my first book and my conversation with my guest, Edgar Garcia. I hope some of you will be able to attend Edgar's talk later this evening, where I'll give you hopefully a more detailed and hopefully more inspired introduction to his fascinating and important work. As you see on the poster, Edgar's visit is made possible by several UO humanities units to whom I feel extremely grateful, beginning with the OHC, which apart from supporting the events today, also offers subvention for the image licensing fees for my book. So thank you very much. Why is Edgar here? I realize it's not the usual format that we do the Books in Print talk. So I'll just say that Edgar is the first and hopefully not the last intellectual friend that I had long hoped that my book would help me find. Because Edgar is a storyteller and will be telling us a story this evening, I will indulge by also telling a well-known fairy tale in very few words. So in the Brother Grimm's 6 Swans, the female protagonist had to laboriously knit 6 shirts out of starflower for her 6 brothers in order to revert an evil spell that had turned them into swans. But she mustn't speak while knitting or the spell would never be broken. She barely succeeds at the end of the story, but as soon as she throws the nearly completed shirts onto the swans and sees them return to human form, begins to speak. For a long time while writing this book, I wasn't able to talk about it. Could not explain it to others or put together compelling grant proposals to receive support. It felt lonely and at times humiliating. But even then, I hoped that one day I would finish knitting or writing this text, whose identity I wasn't entirely sure of, and that I would be able to speak again, and that in the best scenario, the book itself would find me more people to speak with. In the acknowledgments of my book, Edgar is thanked as an anonymous reader. From our conversation last night, I realized that he was the first to hear me speak at the end of my project. If you know the story of Brother Grimm's, you know that she didn't finish her project. I thought this was very interesting because this book, in a way, is not complete. I hope the book is not the end, but the beginning of a conversation with my intellectual friends of the future. So I'm very grateful that Edgar came here to engage me in the first conversation of this kind in public. Hey, my computer. I can speak, but I would never be as eloquent as I am in print. Last night, while sitting at the Gordon Hotel, Edgar actually took me to task on some of the important issues in the book, including mimicry, possession as evacuation, the exact character of possession, and I had to respond to him on the spot. And the whole time I was thinking, with my cocktail, the whole time I was thinking, I said this better in my book. I said this better in my book. So when I went home, I'm so sorry, Edgar must be like scratching his back. I was looking up, like on page 140, I said it like this. So it's much better here. I would just let you circulate my book and also two collections of poetry and a kind of I would say poetic prose that Edgar has published. So instead of getting to the weeds of the chapter by chapter and some of the fine arguments that I am proud of, but I'm not appropriate to spell out here, I would just describe the book in a kind of grossièrement, like kind of in a large overview, and try to describe the agenda of the book. And in a way, it's not a pretext, it's not an excuse for why it took so long. But hopefully you can see why. So the book, I realize now that I can speak, is a chimera. Chimera are two discrepant parts joined together. And the reason why it's a chimera is because it has two main agendas. So on the thematic level, I talk about the theme of the mask in surrealism. So in poetry, in the arts, but also something that we surrealism scholars come to know as the critical theory of surrealism. So the mask is one thing. The second, the second agenda is an intervention in what people are calling ethnographic surrealism for a long time in the field. And it has to do with the intersection between surrealism and professional ethnology of the interwar period. So the book engages already two agendas. In the meantime, because of the nature of the movement itself, I had to engage art history, literary studies, and anthropology, and whatever else, philosophy perhaps. And what I wanted to do was actually to be respectful to all of the disciplines that I actually engage. So that meant not simply citing, but actually engaging with the arguments in all of those fields. So the reason why on the kind of agenda level, it's quite complex. And then I realized, like a tree, so it has like two main branches, and then all the little subsidiary agendas are also complexifying the story. One of them is I try to theorize the feminine through surrealism. I try to theorize the feminine as a type of subjectivity where the active and the passive are not mutually exclusive, but that they can coexist. So that's one subsidiary little branch. There's another small agenda, which is to actually articulate the relationship between magic and poetry, and to theorize that as coeval with reason, which is one of the projects of interwar surrealism. Magic and poetry are coeval and not the more primitive form of reason, or even pre-logical, right, of the primitive mind. So, and how to theorize this and how to make it coherent in relationship to surrealism's anti-colonial political activism, right? So to theorize the connection between a poetic stance and then a political stance. And I also wanted to do something that is probably more relevant for Surrealism scholar, which is the reconciliation of two types of Surrealism that have for long been conceived as mutually antagonistic. A kind of dissident Surrealism represented by people like Georges Bataille, and then let's say orthodox Surrealism represented by the poet André Breton. So I wanted to reconcile or show more parities between these two groups. And one of the figures that really helped me do this is Michel Leiris, the very important poet, writer, the inventor of the genre autobiographical essays. He was very much an intermediary figure between, let's say, orthodox and the dissident surrealisms. So he has a very important place in this book. So he is the subject of this last chapter. And the last chapter is also extremely, to go back to the importance of Michel Leiris. Another reason for Leiris' importance is he was actually a surrealist who became a professional anthropologist, an ethnographer. He went to Africa, he did very good field work. So again, he was the figure that really allows me to kind of carry out all of these different agendas. So a very quick overview, so I'm not going to get into the weeds, but just to show you some of the images and the arguments that I make. So I said on a thematic level, the book is about the persistence of masks, but what is a mask? So the kinds of figures that I consider a mask in this book includes objects such as the veil, such as the hat, such as the head, which is basically a three-dimensional mask. It's a complete object, a thing in the Bataillean way, or the ornament, right? Something that is decorative. But I also show that even things that we consider integral to the body can actually become a mask. So the hand is definitely the one, because the one that can reach the furthest from the core. So you can actually do things with your hand that serves the same function as mask. Actors know this. I know my acting teacher is in here. Gestures, when you speak, the hand is in front. So in a way, it is doing the same work as a mask. And here I just show you the image with which I start the book. You can see the performance artist, poet Cloquin's photograph of hands. Two of them are real. One of them is a mannequin. And then you can see on one of the hands, the pinky has a little small hand on it. So the hand actually can wear a mask, and also even the hand, because it's not one, it's got 5 fingers. So you can it's not a singular monolithic object. Okay, so these are the objects that I consider a mask. So you can see it's not one kind of object. So the mask is the figure by which interwar surrealism represented and theorized the subject or subjects. This is from my book, which can be adopted or released by the self, but are in no way equivalent to it. So I try to argue that for the surrealists, the mask is the new model for the subject, and we'll see that this is actually a model that's very, very, very old. In fact, it's a more universal model for the subject and not the self, right? The bourgeois sovereign self. So the mask in this book will be conceived as a mode of appearance for the subjects that deploys textual or formal material means. So it doesn't have to be an actual thing, right? In order to constitute a contingent identity, which may be taken off. And it's something I really want to insist on. A mask can be taken off. That's how you know it's a mask. If it can't be taken off, it's not right. That's not a mask. Okay, so I think I wanted to show at least this image, and also this is an image I took in the Musée Quai Branly in Paris of these masks that the French ethnographers actually collected, 3,000 objects collected on the Mission d'Akajibouti. So of course the mask can be real masks as well. So here are Dogon dancers wearing their spectacular animal masks, and that this was photographed on the the Dakar Djibouti mission in the 30s, on which Michel Leiris participated. And these actual masks actually can be appropriated quite easily. So the colonial pillage, we don't need to repeat. People, I think, here would be familiar with the story, how the ethnographers systematically sometimes, scam the Africans to get these masks. But precisely for this reason, I think Edgar and I talked about this a bit last night, it is very important for me to be able to theorize the mask as not something necessarily as an object. In the case of Ethiopian Zar possession, Michel Leiris the ethnographer, comes to the conclusion that the mask can be very, very contingent. So the beings that possess the practitioners are conceived by him as masks, and therefore there is the continuity with Surrealism's thematization of the mask. So here's just a couple examples of the extensive photographic documentation of the Zar possession cults in Ethiopia that Leiris studied for 6 months. And these are the examples as masks. Of course, you can see our eyes, because I think as Westerners who have museums and such things, we're very accustomed to using our eyes to see the mask, right? So yes, the Zar practitioners, on the left, the priestess, and on the right, her followers, the people who participate in the cult, they do wear these makeshift costumes, accessories, what's on the hat, on the top of the heads of the Zar adepts, Desh and Abichu. They are wearing the outside of the chickens, the how do you say, the skin of the chicken with the feathers on it as a kind of makeshift costume, a festive hats, kind of Halloween costume. It's just afterwards you can discard. So there are accessories, concrete accessories, but what's most important is actually the theatrical part of this possession, because they have to incarnate all of those beings and say their lines. So you can imagine the mnemonic technique that must be engaged, because these women are illiterate. So you just have to be great memorizers. Again, I'm smiling because I know my acting teacher is sitting in the back. So you just have to memorize. It's a bit like a vernacular theater. So what Michel Leiris, the ethnographer, realizes is that these women have masks, and it's the best way to understand this Zar possession. The mask, I stop. That's the number one agenda, right? The thematic agenda is about masks. But I have to say the part that excites me more, ultimately, intellectually, of the project is the methodological agenda, right? So the methodological agenda, I think I said before, was an intervention in what people call ethnographic surrealism. So ethnographic surrealism, you know how I was just telling my undergraduate students I was teaching, I think the humanist is like 2 steps away from being a con artist, because sometimes what we do is so speculative and it's all about naming things, right? So James Clifford, the anthropologist, developed this term called ethnographic surrealism, right? And it's very funny that even he who came up with the term actually said, well, there are very few examples of it. So, and of course, if you're a classifier, if you're a sociologist, like if you only have one example of that thing, that's not a category, right? It can't be the only thing in that category. So, what did Clifford mean by ethnographic surrealism? What actually it means the confluence between particular surrealists in the late 20s and early 30s and particular professional ethnologists who worked together, who met each other, encountered each other in this very bizarre review called Document. So it's edited by Georges Bataille, and then lots and lots of ethnological, archaeological contributions, along with Georges Bataille's own very eccentric aesthetic theory, the formulas and such things. So ethnographic surrealism really just means kind of document, right? And James Clifford also said, well, there's also another thing called surrealist ethnography. Well, what's surrealist ethnography? There's only one example of that, too, right? So, James Clifford is a wonderful, formidable, very important person. I do not mean to throw him. I consider him to have enabled my book, right? Yeah. But even he, being an honest person, will say, well, the only example of that is what you're seeing on the right, which is Phantom Africa. It is a very bizarre text that Michel Leiris, in his capacity as an archivist for the mission, wrote as a kind of daily journal for the ethnographic mission. So it was meant to be a scientific text, the kind that you would document with the governmental official archives of the mission. But he decided to actually record his own psychological states as well, how he feels. He's like, well, I'm on mission too, so I'm part of the mission, so I can also talk about, my missing my my wife, and I had a dream about Andre Breton and such. So he produces Phantom Africa, and this Phantom Africa, some of you may know, became the example, the icon of a kind of it's a textual form that basically inaugurates a critical form of anthropology. So self-reflexive anthropology, some people call it, or the group writing cultures, where anthropologists become very aware that maybe we're also doing literature, right? Maybe we're also just writing about cultures. There's nothing scientific about it. So I thought, well, maybe I can make a contribution to kind of rethink this a little bit. So I wanted to say, actually, if you think about the ethnographic dimension of surrealism, it is rather unfair and narrow and not exactly accurate to limit it to only the part where certain surrealists overlap with professional ethnologists. So I try to say that if you look at the psychiatric beginnings of surrealism, so many of the surrealist poets were doctors. They served patients in World War I. So the psychiatric dimension of surrealism was already a kind of para-ethnography. So I wanted to talk about the unofficial ethnography of surrealism in a much more expansive way. So I also think this is helpful because the shift to this unofficial ethnography of the subject also alleviates us from the pressure of looking for ethnographic surrealism or surrealist ethnography in places where not to be found. For example, ironically, the stuff that Michel Leiris did on the Zar was not a avant-garde textual form. He published these in absolutely scientific, legit anthropological, even psychiatric journals, and the way he, documented this was absolutely scientific. He had a very excellent classical prose, very, very clear and lucid. So he was not writing Naja or writing a surrealist text with this stuff, right? So I thought if I could talk about the ethnography of the subject, then we don't have to say this was actually surrealist ethnography, because it was not. It was a surrealist who did excellent scientific ethnography, right? But the continuity of with surrealism is, of course, the subject. So I wanted to say something like, the object of this ethnography is actually the subject. So what are the subjects? So I said it began with a psychiatric dimension. So the surrealists regarded psychiatry from the get-go as a kind of para-ethnography of the subject. They were interested in marginal forms of subjectivity that were nevertheless, they must be included in the surrealist conception of the subject that cannot be limited to the bourgeois, self-possessed, moral, sovereign self. Okay, so there's more to subjectivity than the self, and we need to be able to capture it. It's basically the surrealist project. So here are examples of, one could say, protagonists, if you think about it in the surrealist like fiction way, but these are also important women in surrealism that have actually, whose encounter with the surrealists led to writings, new ways of thinking about subjectivity. So on the left, Naja, Léonard Delcourt, who is the protagonist of the récit Naja. And then in the middle, you have Aragon and Breton's re-excavation of the photography of hysteria from the psychiatric hospital Salpêtrière as documented under the neurologist Charcot. And at this point, basically Aragon and Breton were saying hysteria is a false disease, it doesn't exist. However, the women who performed for the camera were actually expressive. This is a supreme form of theatrical expression. And we have documents, we have books like by Didi Uberman who shows that, this very unlikely these women were not aware of the performative aspect of this. And then on the right, you have two, in a way, women with severe mental illness, paranoia, schizophrenic, but they were also criminals, because unfortunately this is how we find out about psychic abnormalities nowadays, is when they intervene with law enforcement establishment. So Aimée was the patient that Jacques Lacan, the psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, wrote his PhD dissertation on, and the Surrealists read this dissertation very, very well. Dali was a big reader, and Aimée was, the subject of Lacan's study, and he actually talked about her literary production. She was a great writer and wrote novels and very fantastic things. And then Christine et Léa Papin, who are criminals because they murdered their masters in this very spectacular kind of crime, and Lacan had actually analyzed these two sisters. They're actually servants, domestic servants. So psychiatry as ethnography of the subject, trying to understand forms of subjectivity that depart from the bourgeois sovereign self. You can see from an interwar perspective, it's probably obvious, that the easiest way to access this kind of subjectivity for the Surrealists was by means of the feminine. So I try to argue that for the Surrealists, the feminine increasingly became a universal form of subjectivity and not the, let's say, secondary, right? As opposed to assuming that the masculine is the predominant one. Okay, so let me just come very, very quickly. I said I was going to talk only for 20 minutes. I'm not at 27. So what does that look like? A form of subjectivity that is expansive. Two images. Those of you who know something about Surrealism know something probably about automatism, which is a form of passivity that we were talking, Edgar and I, about dreams, right? And to what extent you can have lucid dreaming. Well, in the 1930s, what's really important about the revision of automatism is the Surrealists were interested in rearticulating automatism in such a way that actually addresses it as a form of agency. So this is a very important move away from the 20s, where automatism was more about being relaxed, being passive, being a receptacle, being a medium. So in the 30s, they tried to actually articulate this as a form of agency. And Dali has this photo montage, the phenomenon ecstasy, l'extase. So l'extase becomes one modality of this passive-active automatism. And so I make an argument about this collage that kind of goes against previous interpretations of this, because previous, like Rosenkrantz and such, it's all about psychasthenia, this pathology, this complete passivity. And I actually try to argue, Dali sees this as laughing, as pleasure, as jouissance. It's a non-castrative access to jouissance. So, from a masculine perspective, you think jouissance, that means it's castration, right? You lose yourself. But from a feminine perspective, jouissance is fine because you're not thinking from the castrative, that's not a possibility. So from the, let's say, artistic surrealists, we have ecstasy as one. Thank you to Michel Leiris, who gives us actual a socialized practice of this in Ethiopia, which is possession. So possession, and I make a case also, I have to say I bang this because I really want this argument. So it has to be understood not only as passivity, which is the argument the discussion we had yesterday. It was not simply a vacuity. It's about reincarnating, re-embodying different kinds of identities. And we know from any kind of ethnographic studies of like Haitian voodoo or Zar, or you can come to the Taoist temples in Taiwan, right? My native Taiwan. These are identities that have to be very well known, right? So the viewers know which one these are, right? It's not like I'm just incarnating whatever, going to a kind of like beach trance. It's not about that. It's not a rave. It's not a rave. Okay, so no, you have to manifest a persona, and people have to be convinced that it's a persona, right? Ophelia, right, would be like if I'm on stage. So it's a form of vernacular theater. So yes, there is trance, but then there's also the agency that's a performative agency, and that transition is what makes the magic of possession. So I argue, I see Michel Leiris' Zar ethnography from this lens of Surrealism's Ethnography, the Subject, which took 3 chapters to build. So basically, I used the first 3 chapters to build this new paradigm, and then I used the last chapter to say, now I'm going to read this through the paradigm that I just built, which is the Ethnography, the Subject, and not ethnographic surrealism. And I just want to bring you one quote from Michel Leiris, because he says it better than me. And I also really want to end with this figure that I really identify with, which you can see in my preface. It's very important for me to talk about Malcolm Ayehu, the leading priestess of this Zar cult that Michel Leiris encountered, because at least we need one good outcome for a feminine universal subject that has access to non-castrative jouissance that does not end up in jail, right? Or in a mental ward, a psychiatric ward that never comes out. And this is what happens when you are a Western, when you embody that kind of subjectivity, but you live in a technocratic industrial capitalist society with its institutions and its inability to account for this as actually part of ordinary, a wide spectrum of humanity. That's what happens, right? You end up in the psychiatric hospital, but not Malcolm Ayehu, who is the leading priestess of Zar in Ethiopia. So she was a little nutty in her youth. She recovered, mellowed out, and became a great priestess, a great Tsarin, they say. So this is Michel Leiris, and he's very proud of this thing that he wrote in 1931, because then he recycled this exact passage in all the subsequent texts on Tsar. So with Malcolm Ayehu, who's possessed by a large number of different Zars, so she has a huge repertoire, it seems that a special Zar is assigned to each of her everyday activities. It is as Abba Yosef that she fulfills her Christian duties by giving moral lessons to her entourage, as Seifu Chenger that she holds her healer's genda, as Abba Kwes that she used to build houses for sale, keeps up her current house, and does business in general, as Shankit, the black female servant of Rahilo, another Zar, right? You got to keep the hierarchy straight too. It's really like if you think of a Shakespearean actor who knows all the different plays, right? All the characters and how they relate to one another. That she receives guests and serves them drinks and food. Likewise, from a ritual point of view, certain Zars have a very defined role, such as Gregin Selassie, in whose name Malcolm Ayehu presides over the skinning of sacrificial animals. So basically, every one of her Zars, which we can't see because it's possession, is actually a mask as well. Okay, so I'll just end by pointing out one thing that is incomplete about the book. Like the Grimm's story is not complete. So what's next? For me to become an actress? Well, no. no, that's not true. So the book actually, I think, erred on the side of being very optimistic about the mask. So it actually tries to emphasize the good mask and not the bad mask. And I didn't have a lot to say about the bad mask, because all I could say was, it's Western prejudice that demonize the mask and think that the mask is the devil and the larvae and whatever. And I think maybe the next thing that I need to do is actually have a small project that actually does talk about the bad mask. And I also didn't have a lot to say about the self, what that is in the book. So maybe the next project will be about that. So I'm trying to think if I can use this method that I just developed, the ethnography, the subject, to analyze maybe something contemporary. So right now I'm thinking online romance scam would be a really good one to analyze, because you have masking on multiple levels, and you have also a kind of building up a false persona, identity. But that's something in the works, and it will be like a postlude to all of this.
Thanks so much, Joyce, and thank you for having me. And thanks to you all for your intellectual hospitality. Very happy to be here. And I just can't emphasize enough how wonderful of a book this is. You alluded to the fact, I thought you knew this, but I guess you didn't. You alluded to the fact that I was one of the readers for it. And I thought you knew.
I didn't know.
Yeah, but you learned yesterday. But I was just so excited when I read the manuscript and found the work so thrilling, and the final product is even more thrilling. And it has gone through so many transformations even before I saw it, as you told me last night. And along the way, it's picked up so many theoretical objects, right? And it engages with them all in such a lucid and sophisticated way, from like masks, possession, mimesis, fetish, theater, magic, and the feminine. It's really a rich book whose nucleating idea is very powerful, which is a rearticulation of surrealism as a theory of the subject, right? And that kind of pulls us away from more local conceptions of surrealist anthropology that we get from people like James Clifford, right? Either surrealist ethnography or ethnographic surrealism. You're like, well, yeah, that's one part of it, but it's a much more global theorization that involves everything from like the clinic to the court, right? It's it's a big retheorization of subjectivity, and it's very problematic theory of subjectivity insofar as it's transpersonal, right? Where the subject doesn't end at the limits of their own skin, and it's also involved in like various states of meta-personhood, where like the subject can be a vessel for the gods or higher beings while also retaining some kind of autonomy. Very, very tricky, right? Who's to say when and how? What are the boundaries? Both intellectual and even in some cases moral and legal. So yeah, it's a fantastic book, really rich. But I think it's for me like one of the most delightful contributions that it makes. Is it makes André Breton and Georges Bataille best buddies again? It's a heroic accomplishment of like healing the wounds of their breakup, and you do it through Michel Leiris, right? And Leiris, you kind of position him as the mediator. Between what you call on the one hand dissident surrealism, i.e. Bataille, and orthodox surrealism, i.e. Breton. And I guess just to start, I have so many questions. I have questions about masks, possession, mimesis, fetish, theater, all that stuff. But just to start, I guess, since you began with a story, and the Grimm story kind of reminds me of that moment in the Odyssey, right, with the weaving, right, Penelope's weaving, and she kind of has to do it. So it kind of felt like it brought to mind an epic structure for the book, right? Like, and especially since you kept undoing it and redoing it, undoing it and redoing it, undoing it and redoing it. I have a kind of epic question, which is, so Leiris is your hero, right? He's the hero.
One of my favorite. But everybody has a favorite surrealist in that field, right?
But the question is, what was different about Leiris, right? What did he do that Bataille didn't do, that Breton didn't do, that Lacan didn't do, that none of these people did, that Leiris did? Because it's not the case that he was the only one that was thinking about the literary. He definitely, there's lots of anthropologists who thought about the literary. But, what did he do? And you kind of point to the emic at times, but if you can maybe just flesh out what was different about Michel Leiris.
Okay, interesting. Well, my understanding was actually he was the first anthropologist to actually incorporate literary forms of autobiographical content into this text, right? So just a very short, 1934, they come back from the mission. That was 18 months. Marcel Griol, who is a very good ethnologist, leader of the mission, sees this text and says, you're not publishing this because this is going to destroy our whole scientific credibility here. This is a liability from the scientific perspective, right? Because it has Leiris' own personal things. Like, what am I going to do with this? And so when Leiris defied Griol and published it anyway, he was so mad. Because, can you imagine someone from your own lab, right? Those are the scientists who basically, it's a form of betrayal. But guess what? L'Afrique Fantôme failed as a mission journal, whatever, but it succeeded as a iconic literary text, right? And so the amount of verbiage about this, I mean, this text has been edited like 7 times, I think. Like they keep coming up with new editions of La Vie Fantôme. The annotations are incredible. And so in a way it has become a fetish. And I wanted to actually say, well, what about the really good work that he did on the Zar? Like, I'm very interested in these women, the Agadesh and Nabichu. He was very good about they were not just anonymous, they were all carefully documented individuals with personality. She's kind of a trickster. He could not dominate her. She played the French mission like just very, very savvy about how to, and also she did it to her own disciples, right? So these are individuals with personalities, but somehow in the literature about this, if you want to say in the Leiris literature, there's really not a lot about his straight ethnography, right? And so it ended up committing that sin that all the postmodern critics were saying, it's like the white ethnographer subjectivity. Well, yeah, if you keep focusing on La Fille Fantôme, it's all going to be about Leiris. Because it's his text, it's his autobiography. So I also wanted to shift in part for this, because if you shift to his actual scientific work, then I can talk about her. Then I can talk about Makamayehu, who is such an interesting individual, right? If she had been living in a different society, she would have been a performance artist, she might have been an actress, she might have, who knows, like a diva. She was a very good singer. Leiris documented her fighting with her daughter singing. So that's how infiltrated with poetic form these cultures are, right? Even having a fight with your daughter, they use epic kind of language, declamatory, and then they sing. It's a kind of chant, and he would document it. It's incredible. It sounds like that. It sounds Homeric, right? So Leiris is special for me in that way. And he also, he loved music. There's a stereotype that like Surrealists have no interest in music, and he loved jazz. And also because of his work on the Dakar Djibouti, he's a really good Africanist, so he knows extensively Black culture. So those of you who know, I did my PhD in University of Chicago, Hyde Park. Sometimes I'll walk down on 53rd Street and just hearing like Black music and having a really vibrant African American culture around. And I thought, which surrealist, right, could I be walking with and who would be enjoying this and like really connecting with it, right? And I thought it would be Leiris, because he would love this. He would love this kind of music and the kind of atmosphere, the rhythmic ways in which the people in the community talked.
That's great. I get the sense that Leiris also didn't just look at objects, but looked with them. And was able to implicate himself in a lot of these situations, which I think is, to your point, that he has a very literary sensibility in his scientific endeavors. With that in mind, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the Zar. What is the Zar? Right, it's because I think this is a big contribution of the book that you've pulled and distilled out of Leiris and his description, analysis of the Zar, an emic, right, object internal analysis of the Zar, which was an object lesson for me in possession, because I always thought of possession as very much a scene of you call it the general ambiguity of possession in the book, and possession is very ambiguous, and it's meaningfully ambiguous, but I've always thought of it as a form of personal evacuation when you're taken over, right? And it's very important for your argument that is not the case, right? That it's not...
Yes, it is the case, but there's then something else that happens. Yeah. So yes, you do have to induce that evacuation. So talking about passivity, right? Okay, so I'm actively trying to induce passivity. So how do we do it? We do it in wadajas, so these evenings, right? You basically have a group, it's like a party. So it's a soirée, and everybody's sitting there, and then you start singing, and there's drumming, And then there's dancing, of course. There is no possession without bodily gestures, right? Bodily movement, kinesthetic. So people start dancing, and then they dance, and then there's a moment where we feel like the dance has transformed into something different. So it's not just that person's dancing, but they're being danced. You see the same thing in candomblé, right? In Haiti, in voodoo. So there's something else going on, and the person that's dancing is somehow being like a horse being ridden on. That's exactly the term. So the loa is riding the horse, right? The czar is riding the horse. So balazar, the person being possessed, is passive. And at that moment, the shaman comes in, her. So here you see she's doing the guri. Guri is the Ethiopian term. And the shaman comes in and diagnoses, just like a doctor. Like, what I think you have is, let me think about it, is our Abaquesquez. Actually, Abaquesquez is her favorite czar. It's basically a toxic masculine military figure. And she loves embodying that, because when she embodies that, she gets to do toxic masculine things, like breaking up neighborhood fights and stuff like that. So these are personas, there are characters. And the pantheon is vast, but most people who participate have, like, I don't know, like probably less than 5 who are their czars. So if you constantly are possessed by a czar, that czar gets identified with you. I don't know how to explain it better than acting. So you're a great Shakespearean actor. You've like done Ophelia 10 million times. So Ophelia is your czar now, right? So because you know her really, really well. Or Julia is your czar. So it's like that. Except her, who incarnates hundreds of them. She's so good. So that's why she can be in a position to make them come. And so this is bizarre thing where she'll be hanging out with Leiris and the French ethnographers, and she'll just switch between the czars. She'll like, now I'm possessed by Chankit, now I'm Yaba Joseph, and now she's doing this. And then she goes into another thing, and then she'll talk about herself in the third person, right? And so Leiris is like, okay, I see how this works. It's kind of like there are hats that she wears, depending on different occasions. I think your point had to do with something like, is it all an act? Maybe that's kind of where I'm hearing your. It's like,
no.
Or Joyce, are you saying that it's all?
Yeah. Well, no.
Oh,
I'm saying
not.
No. It's an interesting problem.
Right.
Yeah.
However, just to say, Leiris even documented cases because, of course, at the time when he came up with the thesis, it's a kind of vernacular theater. He was like, okay, so does that mean it's fake? Right, but then it's like, again, my acting teacher is acting fake. Well, it depends on what you mean by fake, right? So the Ethiopian women have a discourse when somebody is faking a possession. So he would overhear them like the morning after a soiree, a wadaja, and she'd be like, two women be like, oh yeah, she was possessed by like, this czar, but I think she was just putting it on. So he's like, oh, there is a discourse, there's theater criticism here. There's like, it wasn't good enough, right? Or she wasn't really possessed. It was just superficial, right? Something like that. And so, the way he documents it really makes it very easy to ultimately understand like the importance of czar, how it works. I want to come back to one thing that you mentioned. You said healing. Healing the rift between Botong and Batai. I don't know, maybe it's like the middle age thing, but I really think that's a wonderful way to think intellectually about what I'm doing intellectually with this book too. It is a kind of healing, right? It's a healing of like postmodernism versus modernism. That divide also does not make a lot of sense for people who've looked at the materials. The Botong Batai antagonism doesn't make a lot of sense if you see just, around mid-30s, it doesn't make sense anymore. They're collaborating, they're on the same side. And I just wanted to say, what is the primary function of the czar institution? It is absolutely healing. It's a healing cult, starting from that. But within the healing, there's also civil, there's justice. There's like civil court, because they do civil court.
Municipal function.
Right. But, when we have a civil dispute, what the secular context often forgets is there's healing needed, right? People who are wronged need to be healed. And that is like one's advantage. I can list other advantages. There's one advantage to this kind of integrative institution that is one. So you have, I'm not saying that we should do this. Again, I don't want to romanticize, but there's an advantage to this because then you can do the healing work in medicine when someone's ill, but you can also do the healing work when a daughter is having a fight with her mother, right? You can do the heal in that. Or a neighbor was trespassed or did something terrible to another neighbor. You can also deal with that. So yeah, healing is so interesting.
I want to open it up for audience questions because we're hitting time, but I do want to say one last thing and kind of contextualize why I focused on possession so much in the conversation that we've staged here today, which is because at the very beginning of the book, in the preface, you say you yourself are possessed, right? You've been possessed by these ideas.
By academic disciplines.
And so that was a fascinating opening for the book because it suggested that you are thinking about it in emic terms as well, right? Trying to think object internal. And I call it dirty fingernails writing, right? Like saying a sentence like that is dirty fingernails writing. We're like, like we're supposed to always have really clean hands at the end of our work, but actually not, right? Like our hands get dirty, our fingernails get dirty. And I like to show my dirty fingernails in my writing because, it makes it, in an actorly way, it puts me on stage, right? And I felt that was a dirty fingernails moment, and I just invite you to, I don't know. No, that wasn't a question. I just wanted to say that I loved that about the book.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, one of my readers actually encouraged me to be personal in the preface. Yeah. But I think you might remember from my postscript, I don't mind being personal. I think some of you here are actually my friends. You know me personally at maybe various levels, right? So it's not like a matter of being personal. But when I write a book, it's like being on stage. Whatever is personal must speak the universal voice. So I try to say, how can I reframe the personal in such a way that actually connects to the content of the book and it connects to other people in a way that can be, so I can be in conversation with someone in a different field or a different geographical area, right? So I think, because I didn't know who I was, right? So I was trained in art history, and I've always been in art history, but I've always been very close to conflict. Some of my closest readers are not in art history, and I never was able to kind of come out and say that in a very explicit way, but I think it's obvious in my work. And so the best way I can describe that is that sometimes they, that itself has a equivalent in possession. So I talked about this in the last chapter, not in terms of Zar, but candomblé, because there was another surrealist who also did this kind of work. It was Benjamin Perret, who went to Brazil and did ethnography of candomblé in the Brazilian cities, urban neighborhoods. And he interviewed a shaman, candomblé practitioner, who also had a theory of madness, right? So this is, again, the Western prejudice, like, what was a form of madness? And the professional psychiatry also was very suspicious of candomblé in Brazil, wanted to ban it, says that it produces mental illness, right? And but Benjamin Perret's, ethnography shows, I think, that no. Madness is when the two compete and the person goes mad. So you got two personas going on. It's like I'm Ophelia and Julia at the same time. Okay? So you can't do that. You have to, at each moment, embody one. So when you have Ophelia and Julia at the same time, you go mad. So when you have Abacuex and Rahilo at the same time, you there's a problem. So for candomblé, that's the theory of madness, right? So I knew that I couldn't really, say I'm all these fields, right? I'm writing as a literary scholar and an art historian and all of that. What I can do is alternate. I can alternate. So that's a temporal concept, right? You can alternate only when it's in time. So I don't have to be all at once something. And I really have come to become much, much more humble as an art historian and in respect to the temporal aspect. I think a lot of times art historians look at stuff that's static in museums, and so that's why we have a shared interest in performance and orality for that, because things are in time. But when you think of things as in time, then you can alternate, you can change, as long as that change also observes a pattern. So yeah, in the book I'm trying to, sometimes I'm being art historian, sometimes I'm being that, but I'm aware that I'm doing that. Like, okay, now I'm going to go into like critical theory right here. Now I'm just going to go close reading the Bataille's, like, I don't know, essay on psychological structure of fascism, and then like now I'm going to do close reading of all of these, you know, the ornaments of Art Nouveau ornaments. But I had to alternate. Yeah, sorry.
Great. Joyce, sorry for being late, but you know, I've seen different versions of this project, and so it's really great. Congratulations. Something that came up, I don't know if you addressed in the book. I was thinking about linguistic anthropology and the ways in which, you know, folks like Silverstein and Irvin, so they start, you know, looking into non-Western cultures and trying to figure out the way that they do pronomial reference, you know, I, you, and all of this stuff. And they go, well, you know, all of these ideas that we have about pronomial reference are just totally wrong. We think it's a natural expression of the self. But here's this culture where they have multiple versions of I. And there's one, like Greg Erdman will talk about, you know, one that's involved with spirit possession. When you are being possessed by spirit, you use a special form of the first person pronoun. And so basically can be upending all of these ideas that we have of the kind of pronoun reference being just like a subjective expression, but really, in fact, it's kind of a mask. And so that, you know, when I was studying that in grad school, that was really influential to me. And I say with Michael Lucy in Berkeley, who was using a lot of these things, but also, you know, the people that they were referencing was not just Urban Silverstein, but people like Benveniste and Maus.
Totally.
And so there seems to be like an interesting genealogy from this ethnography and this interest in masks, but also what happens in linguistic anthropology just a couple of decades later, they're referencing all those folks as well. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about that.
I mean, it's totally, I mean, you're kind of reading the same, we're thinking the same way because it's all here too. So the ethnography of Zar shows that every time you incarnate a different Zar, you got to incarnate that language. Because each Zar has a specific class identity, religious confession, so you can be Muslim or Christian, right? So their bodily movements are different. And they also have different regional identities. You have to speak in their accent. And sometimes there are certain Zars that speak only in Pidgin, so you also have to know that Pidgin. So all of these things are kind of the linguistic aspect, and when possession is actually happening. So if you're in one of these soirees, one of the social etiquettes, I'm reading Irvin Guffman. Finally, I'm like, why didn't I read this when I was doing this? It's too late, next book. So one of the social etiquettes is that you do not address anybody who's possessed as a real person, as them. You see what I'm saying? Like, if you're possessed by a character, if I go up to you and say, hey, Roy, I'm breaking the social etiquette of the soiree. You're
Dead naming.
Exactly. Because what I'm doing is I'm basically discrediting your possession in a way, right? So I must address you as the right, using the right persona that you're incarnating. So I think it's absolutely true. I would like to hear another question, but I really have, okay.
Okay,
I have another thing to say about it, but fine. Cut me off.
No, I was gonna, actually I here's what I'm wondering, like in this context, when you're possessed, are some people scared of you?
No, some of the Zars are really sweet.
And some of them are not, or are they all sweet?
They are, they represent the full spectrum of humanity.
Right. So then there are some unsweet ones, presumably.
Okay, I'll tell you who's sweet. I'll tell you who's sweet. This is like a...
I'm more interested in the unsweet.
Okay. Abaquesques, toxic masculine.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So so that's cool. So I'm just wondering, to what extent within this context, both for Leiris as well as her, these possessions could be like not so much bad acting, good acting. Sorry. But that's just telling me you need to leave now. But more like political versus like performative, right? So I've done a lot of research in Southeast Asia context, where sometimes possession really is a way for women or low caste or whatever to be like, stay off my property. I'm haunted right now.
120%. Yeah, okay. It's exactly.
Right. So in that context, like who is the adversary? You know what I mean? Because you described it as a very communal space. Everyone's dancing, but who's like shit?
Two main adversaries. Okay. So in the Ethiopian context, it's layered. First is the Christian patriarchy, right? Because it's Orthodox Christian society with substantial population of Islamic faith, right? And Muslims and Christians are not supposed to condone this, right? There are also Jews, right? As we know, there's Ethiopian Judaism. So what is interesting about the Zar is that it is so outlawed by all three of the Abrahamic religions, but within the Zar convertories are representatives from all three of the, everybody goes to the Zar in interwar Ethiopia. So among the adepts, mainly Christians, but there are also Muslims and there are also Jews. So this is what I mean by a universal institution. And that's what Marcel Griol said, what is peculiar about this? It's kind of subaltern but super universal. And I'm like, this is my case here, right? So they're going against native patriarchies represented by institutionalized Abrahamic monotheistic religions, but then come the Western French ethnographers. So that adds another layer, right? So to talk about possession as politicking, I think we were, I think I was talking about this maybe to one of my students, maybe, right? So yes, the adepts are very aware that if you want a really nice sacrifice, that's just another word for a very festive barbecue party with music and dancing and wonderful food, right? That's expensive. But if you tell the French ethnographers you can record, then they'll pay for that beef, that cow. They'll pay for all the chickens you want. And they use that to manipulate the French ethnographers, right? There's even very interesting episodes where she will manipulate Malcolm will manipulate ethnographers. They don't come to a meeting. Then she says, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I came too late to the meeting. My Zar did it. Abba Quais Quais wasn't me. It was Abba Quais Quais." And then she would have the makeup ceremony. Then, as a way to apologize, she gets possessed by so many Zars all at once, right? It was a very funny scene. And basically, all the Zars profess themselves to be slaves of the French, I'm quoting, right? So this is like mocking at the colonial masters here, right? It's hilarious. You know, I would say the political is there. Should I go on? I can really
No,
go
I'm
on.
good. I'm
Okay.
good.
Okay.
And I kind of have to go.
Okay, all right. We have 12 minutes
To be
before we
continued.
hit the threshold. Michael.
Just what a pleasure to hear this sort of overview of your book. And I was curious, I mean, it's a sort of an aside that you mentioned of alternating between art history and comparative literature as though those would be two poles of your training or intellectually. And yet at the same time, you're talking about the Zar as a matter of possession, which gives us a different sort of verb than one that would involve alternating. And I was curious, it just had me thinking of what would it be to translate the modality that you're reading through Leiris's ethnography of the Zar, which involves a type of shuttling that's not actually comparison, one field and another field, but a type of transformation. And if you were, as an art historian, one could say literary scholars and art historians share aesthetics as a common term. But if you were to borrow from transformation or the kind of vocabulary you're drawing for performance, that would allow you a different problem space for thinking the art history comp lit rather than alternating. Do those two fields interact for you? Are you possessed by art history when you're a comparatist? Are you possessed by comp lit when you're an art historian? What would happen to your understanding of those fields in that sense?
Okay.
Sorry to be quite
I
abstract.
think I get what you're saying. I think. Okay, so you can tell me. So not only art history and comp lit, right? It's anthropology. I read so much in anthropology. Sometimes, like, is that what you really wanted to do? Because you could just be like, you know, it was like anthropologue manqué. Like I missed my chance to be an anthropologist, right? So I actually did a podcast for this book. It's on the Minnesota website, and my interlocutor, Jonathan Ebern, actually asked me this question in terms of interdisciplinarity, right? And I think I gave her like not bad answer. I said something like, you know, for me, actually, the nightmare would be if the neoliberal academy finds out that I'm so interdisciplinary and so, able to do all these things. And they would say, why don't we just have Joyce Cheng go over to anthropology and teach, and then we can fire a anthropologist, right? Why can't we just reduce faculty? And because you're all the interdisciplinary, right? So why don't we just have Michael Allen come and then like fire somebody in another unit, because you know that they're thinking like that, right? They want to reduce staff. So for me, it's like, no, I want all of these characters. I want to, because the characters are like wonderful characters and they're not doing compatible things. If you think about it, Abba Yosef is like the teacher kind of persona. He's the teacher character. So he's like pontificating, telling people how to well behave, whatever. And then there's Seifu Chenger, right, who has to hold the tray. And then Abba Kwesque, who's toxic masculine. Like, it's not the same persona at all. Abba Kwesque does things like kick down a pillar, like break stuff, break up neighborhood fights, and builds houses. And, he's like the tough guy, right? And then she has to become Shanki. This is a really strong contrast. Shanki is the sweet one. So sorry, Sangeeta. Sangeeta is often Shanki. Those of us who know her personally. Very hospitable, sweet hostess who's like, oh, do you want to eat something? Here is food and drinks. Not the same persona, right? And so we want the richness. So yesterday we had a conversation about richness. What does it mean to have a rich life? And we find like industrial capitalist life very, very poor in symbolic form and actions, right? And it's because we don't have diversity in that way. And so I was telling Jonathan Ebern, like, I want the disciplines to be holding their own, right? Because if anthropology just becomes literature, if all the anthropologists start going, I'm going to be like writing Phantom Africa here, then there's nothing as a literary person for me to learn from them, because you're not doing anything I'm not already doing, right? So I need you to be like extremely, sometimes even positivist, go Durkheim, do Moss and do all of that. So I can come to you and be like, wow, you're really good at reading cultures that do not have extensive written documents, and you have amazing research materials about rituals and rhythm and all that. So I have something to learn from you, right? So I don't want them to actually become one. So I want to alternate. I want to like, right now I'm doing like, I'm in my mode of like, I'm being Masamos right now. And then like the next chapter, maybe I can be, here's like Joyce Cheng's like aesthetic stuff, right? Because I would hate this to be, can you imagine what like the what they're thinking in the provost's office? Like, it'd be great. We'll just cancel anthropology and have all the literary scholars do it. Yeah, that would be really scary to me. Yeah, Daphne.
So, one, fellow Leiris stan. So, but one thing that I was really thinking about as I was listening to you was I was thinking about the different modes that possession can take, and thinking about like societies in Central West Africa where the masks are secret societies, and so when you encounter the mask, you're not like encountering a possessed person, you're encountering the divine being themselves. And so I was wondering about these different modes and ways in which possession, for lack of a better word, can sort of take place. Then also how the idea of the mask as concealing versus the mask as a object that indicates that the person is no longer there, that piece. And then also how these ideas of psychiatry were influencing how people like Leiris were thinking about possession and masks when they encountered them in West Africa. And I know that was a lot of not super well-formed, dispersed things, but I was wondering if you could just talk about, especially those ideas of concealment and the ways in which the ideas of psychiatry in Europe at the time were influencing how the ethnographers were understanding what they were seeing.
Yeah, so one very quick thing I can say to that is, one of the essays that Leiris published in the 30s on the Tsar, so he published, just like any good academic, he published articles.
Yeah.
So it appeared in a psychiatric journal, right? Because he was studying, this is a medical establishment here, right?
Yeah.
Just because Western, ethnographers come and see them singing and dancing does not mean that this was not a healing, right? So it was actually published in the psychiatric journal. So absolutely, and that's the nice thing about the French context, because it's so clear, it's so well documented. Those of you who know Lévi-Strauss, the Tristopique, he writes, how did he prepare for field work before going into the Amazons, right?
Yeah.
In the psychiatric clinic. And he would say, nothing has prepared me better for field work among the Amazonian Indians than sitting there in the hospital of Sainte-Anne and having to talk to patients who tell me all kinds of strange tales. A woman who, I think the one I used as my epigraph was the woman who, she said, I have to wear all these clothes because I'm actually an ice cube. And if I don't wear all these clothes, I'm going to melt, right? And so it's the psychiatric context that actually prepared the ethnographer. And then I think that's why it's so important that the Tsar has this importance for me, as opposed to the Dogons, who have amazing maps, no question about that, which is why they all got stolen, right? And the Tsars don't have objects. So weirdly, how much stuff that they took from Ethiopia, the French mission? They took all kinds of manuscripts and amulets, everything, but it's all from the Christian church. They couldn't take anything from the Tsar. Because what is there to take? It's possession, it's a practice, it's a performance, it's a ritual, it's the repertoire that they've memorized. These women are illiterate. So the best thing that they got out of it was he got one of the clergy, a Christian clergyman who was actually a kind of hidden, a kind of peripheral figure of the Tsar cult, because he wasn't supposed to. He's actually a clergyman, so he's not supposed to. But he healed from an elephant as a skin, paralysis, and he believed that the Tsar helped him. So he joined the cult. But because he was literate and he could draw amulets, Leiris got him to draw the Tsars. So that's the manuscript that I presented in the last chapter. So we got some kind of iconography, but it's made up because it's possession. It's the center. You cannot draw this. It's the performance. It's the mask, right? And so concealment. I have 3 minutes. So concealment. So I, again, like what I was saying, I know there's a weakness in the book, which is that I kind of overestimated the good mask, right? So I kind of address how, why the monotheist Christian and Western Christianity vilified the mask for several centuries, right? Starting from the Middle Ages. So it's a larvae, it's the devil, because it shape shifts, it alternates. Anything that alternates can't be good, right? It's be the devil, because it's shape shifting. It's not eternal, it's not Platonic image. Anyway, so it's not the idea. So the devil, whatever. And also the idea in the 18th century, because it's secular now, it's not a devil, but rather it's inauthentic, right? So that's something I talked about too in the Rousseau's time, the French Revolution, right? It's don't be fake. So they're trying to demask the hypocrisy of French court society, right? All the etiquette and all of the galanterie, it's very false. Let's just all be natural. So I sort of vilify concealment in this book, I know, in a way that I sort of say this is a prejudice to the Western prejudice to think of the mass as concealment. Now, I am older. Every year I get older. And that is not the full story, obviously, because I wouldn't want to be read as saying concealment doesn't exist or inauthenticity doesn't exist. And so you're right in the sense that you can conceal. It does conceal. I emphasize more the mask as showing, right? Because the mask, that's the problem with the mask. It both conceals and shows, right? But concealment in the case of Tsar, did the women, the Abichu and Ayehu and Malcolm, did they use the Tsar as concealment? Oh, absolutely. Of course they did. Of course they did. I just gave an example. They didn't come to their appointment on time. They told the ethnographers, be here this time, we'll have a big sacrifice. And they don't show up. And they're oh no, because Abaquesques didn't want me to talk to you, right? So yeah, they're totally doing it too.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is Leiris also has an extensive analysis of the practice of apology. And I talk about that in my chapter. So what often you'll find is that they'll use the czar excuse, but then later they'll apologize for that czar. They'll be like, I'll just apologize for Abba Quace. You know, he was upset. He didn't want me to talk to you. And so Leiris is like, well, if you're apologizing for your czar, I take it that's you trying to save face and you are trying to apologize to me, but you don't want to come out and say you're apologizing to me. So you're going to make about quiz. And I don't know, because I'm Asian, so I understand we have a version of this stuff in my native culture. So I'm like, yeah, my aunt does that all the time. Like, my mom does that all the time. Yeah, there's a kind of weird, like, redistribution of responsibility using, you know, or like your father is really upset that you, like, no, it's not your father, it's her, right? So there's this thing that they play, except it's more complicated because the czars are there and they're not visible, right? And so yeah, I'm not going to deny that they do that too. They do conceal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. This was so much fun.